To start with, are there any comments from the public on items not on the agenda? Hearing none, we will go to the first item. Good afternoon, members of the Finance Committee. I have a request here today from Habitat for Humanity for $925,000 in agency housing set-aside funds to acquire property and land bank the site for future development. The address is 822 to 824 East Canon Perdido. And Bob, could you just put up that first, give a little location here? It's just a couple doors west of Milpas. So the property involves two adjacent parcels with 19,300 square feet. It's a little under half an acre. It's currently owned by American Riviera Bank, and it's improved with two single-family homes. Bob, you can put up the next one. And the zoning on the site is C2. Now, the site was previously owned by a developer who secured entitlements for 8 condominiums that were never built. Habitat seeks to build more units than that, and they plan to build units that are more suitably designed for low-income households. The current plans involve large units with just 1 or 2 bedrooms. And they also, the plans also involve a type of construction that would be difficult to execute by volunteers. So Habitat believes that 12 units are possible, and they've had some preliminary discussions with Planning Division staff. This would require a density bonus, and since we have condominiums here, this whole thing would then be reviewed by Planning Commission. Later on, once the plans are approved, then Habitat would likely return to the city for additional funds for construction. The typical Habitat model is one that is a true community-wide effort. They rely on donated materials. They rely on technical assistance from local contractors. There's sweat equity from the future homeowners, and there's a whole lot of volunteer labor. And they also rely on grant funds from local foundations and churches. The result then is affordable ownership housing for low-income households, which is a segment that we rarely are able to give the opportunity of ownership to. The site has been appraised at $965,000. Habitat has negotiated a sale price of $925,000. This is about $48 per square foot, and we feel this is a very good price. The $925,000 agency loan would cover the acquisition price. The terms of the agency loan would be similar to terms of loans that we've provided to Habitat in the past. This is like a 0% interest loan with no payments due during construction. And then once construction is complete, the loan would convert to separate loans with each of the individual homeowners. So if we're able to build 12 units here, we would have 12 rollover loans, one for each homeowner, and in the amount of about $77,000. These rollover loans would then be second to loans that Habitat would be providing for each individual homeowner as well. The agency loan to the homeowner then would be zero interest. It would be a deferred loan, and it would be forgiven after 90 years. So we also have a provision in the loan that we're going to be giving to Habitat that if they don't proceed in a timely fashion on this project, that we would then ask for repayment of our agency loan. Our loan would be secured by a deed of trust in first position during construction, and then after construction in second position. And based on the values that we're talking about here, we would be fully secured. We would have a covenant on the property for each of the individual homeowners. This would be in accordance with the city's affordable housing policies and procedures. It's a 90-year covenant. If somebody sells before then, the unit, Habitat then purchases the unit back, and then they find a new income-eligible homeowner, and then that new homeowner signs for the balance of that 90-year term. So we're ensured that we're going to have 90 years of affordability on these units. Since we have 2 occupied units, there could be some relocation involved. People will be allowed to stay as long as they want during the pre-development phase, but once Habitat is ready to start construction, which could be 1 to 2 years, then if there are people still there on site, then we might have some relocation expenses for this project. We also have a replacement housing plan. Since we're using RDA funds for this, and since one of the units is occupied by a low-income household, then we have to plan for the replacement of affordable housing units that are lost on the site. And so we will be replacing them with the new unit that we're building on the site. So it'll all be done within the site. And so this plan would have to be adopted by the agency board. The site is also outside the Central City redevelopment project area, and so we would be asking council to adopt a resolution that would affirm that this project would then benefit the CCRP. There are some sustainability features to the project. Habitat would be deconstructing carefully the existing structures. They would be recovering usable materials and selling them in their restore. The new units would be built to Green Santa Barbara guidelines, and they're looking at LEED certification and solar power. Typically in Habitat projects, 10 to 15% of the new construction comes from reused materials. And Habitat is also looking at doing a sustainable landscaping plan for the site. So in conclusion, this is a next important step for Habitat. They're in the process of finishing up a project on 618 San Pasquale. This is 4 units on the west side. So this would be a good next project for them to take on. We're looking at a very good price on the property. We have the money on hand, and we have, these are funds that can only be spent on affordable housing. So I ask that you recommend approval of the loan to the agency board, and this concludes my presentation. We have Joyce McCullough and John Peterson from Habitat here in case you have any questions for them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Any questions from committee members?
Thank you. So these properties would not generate any property tax to the state or the city, is that correct?
Councilmember Self, I believe there is a low-income exemption for properties like this that would apply. So yes, taxes would not be paid.
While Habitat for Humanity is the owner, he needs to go to the Yeah. So during the time that Habitat for Humanity owns the property, we do have a tax exemption that would be through the period of construction. We have worked with the County of Santa Barbara on our previous projects, and because there are government-mandated resale restrictions, the property taxes are paid, but they're paid at that reduced rate.
Okay. Once the owners are in, then they pay at what they purchased. Thank you.
At that affordable price.
Thank you. The loan structure here, is that the same structure we've had for the other two properties on Villa Lucero and San Pasquale? In terms of there was a loan going to Habitat, then it gets divided up to the tenants, and the whole. It's just similar to what we've done before. Okay.
Mayor Schneider, yes, it's a similar model.
Okay, and the relocation to current tenants, as it says in the report, you have to. They might be eligible for relocation benefits in accordance to state and federal law. Our current city relocation assistance doesn't apply here, if I'm correct, because that is in case something is demolished for market rate condos. Is that correct? Or
Mayor Schneider, that is my understanding, that the tenant displacement ordinance would not apply in addition to the relocation benefits that they would be getting under state and federal law.
Okay, but state and federal law is part of this because of the project that we're looking at here with Habitat. Okay.
Right, we're looking at the state funds for acquisition, and then we're also looking at perhaps federal funds in the future for construction.
Okay.
So both would apply.
Both would apply there. And I had a third question, but I spaced on it, so I think it must be okay. But no, you've had a good track record in Santa Barbara, so congratulations to that, and sounds like a good third. Oh, that I now remember. See, you just keep talking. And are you just in very, very preliminary discussions with the planning department? Do you have any plans? I mean, we hear 12 units, but that's pretty much the parameters of what we're looking at so far in terms of design and style and all the other details. That's still in the works.
Yeah, Mayor Schneider, we have been talking preliminarily with Betty Weiss and Danny Cato just to talk about what's feasible and doable on the site. And then we've also talked with our architect who's currently working on our San Pasquale project to see if there is a way architecturally that that number of units can be accommodated on that site. But really preliminary, sort of back of napkin kind of sketching. We've gotten sort of a green light from both planning staff and from our architect that can be done. We will be putting out a request for proposals for architecture to a number of different architecture firms in the city. Part of that, of course, as Mr. Kiefer's already said, is the ability for volunteers to construct it. It's got to have some green components to it. We want to continue to go more and more green as we build, and livability of the site in terms of enough open space, enough parking, and that kind of thing. So there will more than likely be some density bonus modifications and things that will come up as we go through the design process, but we have just begun talking about that at this point.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay,
Thanks.
very good. I have one question also for, I think probably for you. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name?
I'm Joyce McCullough. I'm the executive director of our local affiliate.
Great, thank you. So the land price per unit, the way it's being penciled out right now, is around $77,000. What do you expect the house part of this to cost per unit? Just ballpark.
Yeah. Thank you, Councilmember Francisco. We are committed to keeping these homes affordable. So we actually don't set the price until we have selected the families and found out what their ability to pay is. Our motto is that we want to keep every family's shelter costs within 35% of their annual income. So we take that into consideration when we're setting the actual sales price.
I see.
Obviously, in Santa Barbara, that requires some subsidy. We're working on some financing models that will help us maybe recapture that at the other end with an equity share agreement, that kind of thing that helps us maintain our financial sustainability, but our primary goal is to keep the homes affordable. So we set the repayment plan with the families based on their ability to pay.
Okay.
So that's kind of a non-answer, but we don't know until we have it built
Sure.
and what the family's income requirements will be.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. Would someone like to make a motion on this topic?
I move that we accept the allowing the loan for this project to go forward.
Okay, I'll second that.
Very good. Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I guess no one's opposed. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. On to the interim financials.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bob Samario, Finance Director, and we are here to present to you the first quarter's report on the status of our revenues and expenditures for this year. As you know, every quarter we come to the Finance Committee and report to you how we're doing, not only the general fund but our enterprise funds. Clearly, the mid-year and third quarter reports are a lot more meaningful because we have more information to be able to kind of understand and see where we might end the year. Up to 3 months, it's difficult for us to make projections, but we try anyway. But we are going to be covering the general fund mostly, and then a little bit of the enterprise funds. And as usual, we'll start with looking at revenues in the general fund. And Jill Tara, our treasurer manager, will start, and she'll be followed in by Rudy Livingston.
Good afternoon, committee
Tara.
members. Jill Tara, Treasury Manager, and I'm going to go through the General Fund first quarter revenue results for fiscal year 2011. And as Bob mentioned, at this point in the year, through September 30th, we really only have 3 months' worth of data. So it's really difficult to make any sort of sweeping conclusions about where we'll end the year. But we do come to you each quarter to give you a preliminary look at how we're doing and to highlight any issues that might be known at the time, any problems with the budget. Because after all, you adopted the budget numbers back in June, and sometimes things change. But I'm happy to report that at least on the revenue side, there are no known issues at this point. As you can see on the overhead up above, I'll go through the 4 major tax revenues in the general fund, and then we'll talk briefly about the departmental results through September 30th. Now, the 4 major tax revenues that we primarily look at each quarter would be sales tax, property tax, transient occupancy tax, or TOT, as well as UUT, which is our utility users tax comprised of different sectors. And we really look and focus on these 4 major revenues because these 4 major revenues comprise 80% of general fund revenues. So sort of how these go, generally that's the way the general fund goes. And I would like to note that my overhead is is based on an accrual basis, which means we're matching time periods for the data for the revenues that are received. So in some cases, particularly in the case of property tax, it's going to be different than what's presented in your agenda report, because your agenda report will show some sales tax received through the first quarter, but we accrued that back to the previous fiscal year, so that was really June 30th results. So starting with sales tax up above, in the blue section you can see fiscal year 2010, we ended the year at $16.7 million. On an actual basis, that was a decline of 5.1% over fiscal year 2009 sales tax, roughly about $900,000 underneath what we received in 2009. Now, our adopted budget for 2011, you can see in the orange section, was $16.4 million, and we assumed that sales tax would come in at 0% growth. You can see the next column over, the growth needed. We can actually decline 1.6% in sales tax this fiscal year and still meet budget, because we based our budget numbers on a year-end estimate, and we came in, although under fiscal year 2009 results in 2010, last fiscal year. It was actually a little bit better than we thought, so that's good news. Year to date, we haven't received anything for the September quarter. We won't know the results of that until mid-December when we get our payment from the state. However, what we do know is that we budgeted 0% growth, and the state has revised their advance estimate rate to us at 0%. So, and that's based on the sales tax returns that have been filed by businesses throughout the state. And usually when they do send out a revised advance rate, it's usually pretty dead on. So we expect at least through the first quarter to be right in line with our 0% growth, which would put us a little bit ahead of budget. So that's where we are. We don't have any hard data, but as soon as we get that in September or in December, we'll be sending that out to you. The next major revenue, which is our largest general fund tax source, is property tax. We ended last year at $23 million, which was pretty much right on with our year-end estimate. We budgeted fiscal year 2011 property tax at just under $22.8 million, which was a 1% decline. We can decline 1.1% this year and still meet our budget. And again, like sales tax, we don't have any information year-to-date yet. Sales tax is paid, property tax is paid twice a year, so we get our major payments in December and May. But based on the information that we received from the county, based on the actual assessed roll that they sent out to us, our numbers in September, we're right in line with a 1% decline. The only wild card contained in our property tax estimate would be the supplemental property tax, and that's tax assessed when properties change hands, and it's when the property sells for a higher market value than is what's shown on the assessed rolls. So they will charge the new property owner, the buyer, supplemental tax, and we've estimated that at $300,000. Came in just under $250 last year, so we think we're right in the ballpark. Sales and market values stay the same, but that is one thing that's not contained in the county estimate that they give us. But we don't see any problems with property tax at this point. The next tax is TOT, or transient occupancy tax. That's the bed tax that's charged to hotel occupants that come to our city. And the amounts up there are just the 10% that's received in the general fund. We budgeted this year, fiscal year 11, at $11.16 million. We estimated it flat, and as you know, we ended last year about $300,000 to the good, so we can actually decline 2.7% this year and still meet budget, but we don't believe that's going to happen. I try and give council monthly updates on how we're doing on property tax, and as you'll recall, year to date, bed tax, and as you'll recall, year to date, we're up 8.7%. In July, we were up 12.8%, August 7.9%, and then up 4.4% over prior year's months. So we hope that trend will continue throughout the year. UUT, We budgeted this year a 1.3% growth, putting our adopted budget for this fiscal year at $7.04 million. And our growth needed, we didn't do quite as well as our year-end estimate in UUT based on declines in the gas and electric sectors last year. They didn't do as well as we thought they would. So our growth needed to meet budget is 0.4%. Year-to-date, we've received 1.2, which is actually a 3% growth, and that's due primarily to the gas sector doing better than we thought. We received some preliminary information from the gas company when we were putting our budget estimates together, and they expected the commodity price to remain low, and it's risen a little bit, and so we've seen that directly translate into better year-to-date on UUT. So we hope that will continue too.
Natural gas.
Yeah, natural gas, not gasoline. And then below the line there, you'll see departmental revenues basically came in flat last fiscal year at $26.5 million, just a little bit under the 2009 levels. And overall, departments budgeted 5.1% growth this fiscal year for an adopted budget of $27.49 million. Year to date, we've received $6.6 million, which is a decline of 4.8%. But Bob's going to put up an overhead now. We can go through each of the departments, and although that looks like a decline, I think when you see the results of the individual departments, you'll see that we're not so concerned about that. Community development, and I'll just go through the ones with the major variances. When you look at a year-over-year analysis for the first quarter, community development is down roughly $130,000, and that's due primarily to building permits down year-over-year. But they did adjust the budget downwards. So in terms of when you look at an analysis of percent of budget, they're slightly ahead of budget, and so we don't see any overall concerns in that department. In the fire department, you can see that they're ahead of the year-to-date first quarter results last year by about $156,000, and that's due to mutual aid revenues received in the first quarter. Last fiscal year, they hadn't received any mutual aid revenues in the first quarter, so that's due primarily to that. We see in police down almost the same amount that fire's up, and we've seen that parking citation revenues are down both year-over-year analysis and also below budget. They did budget an increase in that, so we're continuing to analyze that variance, and we'll be looking and watching that closely, as that is a major revenue for their department.
Are people obeying the law, or are they just paying their ticket on time? Because I think that's what happened before.
They're paying later, and I'm not sure at the numbers of citations that have been written. I'm not sure.
Because I remember when we upped the fee after 10 days too high, people started paying more on time, which meant that it was a loss of revenue because people were smart and they could pay online too.
This is true. A couple of years ago, the penalty for paying late essentially doubled the amount of the citation.
Right.
And we saw a big drop-off when we did that.
Okay.
So it just became too expensive not to pay on time.
All right.
Yeah. And the last one I'd like to point out, which almost entirely explains the year-to-date variance in departmental revenues, would be the library. And this is essentially a timing issue. The county per capita money that we receive for from the county for running the libraries, as well as the admin fee, was received in October, and usually that's received in September. So we have received it. It's not reflected in the first quarter results, but once you factor in that payment, they're right on track. So while it shows year-to-date a variance of $330,000 under the year-over-year analysis and down 4.8, when you factor out that timing issue, departments are right on line with their service charges. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on these revenues I've covered or any other ones. Otherwise, we can turn it over to Rudy Livingston for the expenditure analysis.
Just one comment on the police revenues. They are down parking enforcement officers more than they normally would be. I know that they're looking to rehire and fill those spots, so I think they're anticipating that the revenues will start to crop back up or creep back up once those vacancies are filled.
Okay. Any other questions from committee members? Okay.
These are the slides that are actually in your packet, but for
Okay. Mr. Livingston.
Thank you, Mr. Francisco. My name is Rudy Livingston. I'm the accounting manager for the city, and I'm here to discuss the general fund expenditures as well as enterprise fund operations. The slide that you see in front of you shows we did two different comparisons. We started doing this last year in the early part of the year, where we show the budget to actual with encumbrances and without encumbrances. And we've discussed in the past, encumbrances can be provide a large distortion to numbers at the early part of the year, because typically those are for contracts or services that will be provided throughout the entire year. So when you throw those encumbrances in that first quarter, it really front loads it and makes some funny numbers. So I'm going to be focusing on the column that right kind of there in the middle that says variance without encumbrance. The first thing that you'll notice there is that overall, as a general fund, we're approximately $1.2 million unfavorable variance at September 30th. And this is almost entirely due to one factor, that our payroll, we get paid every 2 weeks, and every once in a while we have, because of that 2 week the 2 week payroll cycle, we end up with 7 pay periods in a particular quarter instead of 6, and that's exactly what happened here. So we had 7 pay periods post to that first quarter, and so it provided about a 1.6% variance in salary and benefits, and that will even out throughout the remainder of the year. So it's not an area of major concern at this point in time, but it makes things look really, really interesting and kind of funny there. The total of that payroll variance was about $1.5 million, to put it into perspective. So you can see that covers just about all of it. I would like to make a couple of notes here, though, that you'll see that the total annual budget is about $102 million. This is a reduction of $2.5 million from the prior year budget. So we're actually down. We're starting with the basis that's a little bit lower than what we had in the prior year. I'm going to discuss briefly 4 different departments that we see on the schedule there. You'll see that the police department, first of all, is $542,000 above their year-to-date budget. Well, when we calculate this budget, when we talk about year-to-date budget, we're talking about 25% of the overall annual budget here. So it's not a precise thing, but it's an estimate. There are 2 primary reasons for that. The first one is what I just mentioned, and that's kind of the overriding theme in most of these. But there's also $225,000 of additional overtime costs in the police department in the first quarter. And this is fairly normal because we have Fiesta and we have 4th of July and some things that front load some of those costs. And that is expected to normalize throughout the remainder of the year. The second department is the fire department. While they also have this timing difference on the salaries and benefits, they're having a little bit of an issue right now with the minimum overtime staffing that they're required to have. They've had some firefighters that have been out on medical leave, and because of them being out, they've had to bring in other people to backfill for those. And so they're running in that particular category about 10% above where they would normally be. And we are going to be keeping a good eye on that for the next couple of months. And if we have to, we'll bring a recommendation for some additional appropriations to council a little bit later on in the year. But that's what's happening with the fire department right now. Parks and Recreation, they're $318,000 over their year-to-date budget, and this is also somewhat normal when you consider that they have a lot of summer camps expenditures in July and August that tend to front-load those. The last one that I wanted to bring up briefly is the non-departmental, which we bring up every year. The primary reason for the non-departmental being over the year-to-date budget is because we have some debt service for the general fund that's paid out of there, and the debt service isn't paid 1/12 every single month. It's actually paid whenever it's due, and the first payment happens to come due in the first quarter of the year, so that skews those numbers a little bit. If there are no questions on the general fund expenditures, I'll move on to briefly discuss some of the enterprise funds.
Okay.
Okay. The enterprise fund revenues, the enterprise fund revenues are calculated on a year-to-date basis for the revenues based upon an average seasonal collection rate. And so that's not 25%. We look at actually what we've collected in those particular funds over the last 3 years, and we apply that rate to those. You'll see in there that revenues in 4 of the 6 funds are below the year-to-date budget at September 30th. But the other thing that you'll notice, if you look at the year-to-date percentage compared to the 3-year average, is that almost all of those funds are within 1% of that year-to-date number. So it's, while we're going to keep an eye on things, it's not necessarily an overall major concern at this point in time, but we will be monitoring that, and we'll let you know how things are going a little bit later in the year. A couple of funds I do want to bring up, though, is the airport fund. You'll notice that they're actually running above their year-to-date budget. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, passenger counts have been coming back up again. They've seen increases ranging from 2.4% to 5.4% per month in each of the first 3 months of the year, which is a good thing. The second thing that we wanted to point out is that non-commercial aviation revenues are running ahead of where we anticipated they would be. One of the big reasons for that is the general aviation landing fee, which we impose at the beginning of I think it was in July 1st it became effective, and that is actually being very positive, and it's brought in an additional $47,000 of revenue to the airport. So those two factors right there have or make things look pretty good out there. The water fund revenues were below budget by $266,000, below the year-to-date budget, and we're monitoring that because that one, while it's only within 0.8% of the of the year-to-date budget, 88% of the the revenues in the water fund are actually from metered water sales. And we know that with a mild summer that we had, the irrigation sales aren't quite as high as we would normally see. We're going to have to kind of keep an eye on them as we go through the wet, wintry months to see where we end up, and we'll keep you posted on those as we progress further into the year also.
Fortunately, when their sales are down, so are their costs for the purchase of water, so there tends to be an offset, not a one-to-one, but some offset.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, exactly, and there's a lot of factors that go into that, so that's a good point. The last one that I want to mention on revenues is waterfront revenues, which are down approximately $100,000 over the year-to-date budget. There are two primary reasons for this. One, last year in the first quarter, we saw slip transfer fees kind of bump back up to a more normal rate, and then after the first quarter, they went back to the depressed rate that we've been seeing over the last year or so. That trend seems to be continuing, and the slip transfer fees have actually been at that kind of lower rate that we've had since this recession began, and staff believes that pretty much is tracking in line with home values and property sales around here. So they're kind of expecting that that's probably going to continue on for a little while. The other thing that affected their revenues is parking. It was an interesting phenomenon this summer that it was cooler than normal, but we had heavy fog along the waterfront most of the time down there, and it was interesting. The staff noted to me that sometimes they would walk across Cabrillo Boulevard and it would be sunny, and then they'd come back over to the beach side and it would be foggy. And so that impacted significantly the number of visitors that came to the waterfront area. They will keep an eye on that, and they're making adjustments to their expenditures to compensate for those losses of revenues also. On the expenditure side of things, generally, the major story is really that extra payroll that came into those funds during those periods. But you'll notice that a lot of them are actually below their year-to-date averages. And the reason for that is because there are a lot in the enterprise funds. They tend to be a little bit more capital intensive. They have a lot more projects going on than in the general fund departments, and so a lot of the expenditures are actually encumbered at the beginning of the year, and so those aren't showing up in that expense number, but they will be a lot of those will be recognized throughout the remainder of the year, and so we'll just keep an eye on that. The one where we do have a negative variance is in the golf fund. And right now, that is primarily due to that extra payroll period that I previously mentioned. And it's not an overall concern, but we will continue to monitor that. And with that, I don't have really any more comments to mention at this time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, very good. Any questions from committee members?
I have one.
Sure. Yourself?
So is the golf course recovering its loss of people at the gate?
That's a really good question. The golf course, actually, revenues are, as you'll see on the schedule there, they are tracking a little bit lower than the year-to-date average would indicate. They have put into place some programs where they have beefed up their marketing, and I had a conversation with the golf course manager this last week, and he indicated that those are actually moving along very in a positive way. They're putting promotions in to have some more unlimited golfing time in the evenings after a certain time. There are a lot of different promotions, and it seems that people are starting to respond to that. So they're hopeful that the golf revenues are going to be in line with the budget. Now, they may not surpass the budget, and we may not see great numbers out there, but they are hoping at this point in time that those numbers will track in line with what we budgeted for the year.